I moved here for peace. After 21 years in the Army Corps and a long, messy divorce, all I wanted was a quiet cul-de-sac where my daughter and I could start over. No noise, no drama, just maple trees, cut lawns, and the kind of silence that feels earned. But peace is fragile. It started with a few trucks, big ones, uncovered, loaded to the brim with wet, red clay. They came rolling in just after sunrise every day, dragging mud across our street like it didn't matter who lived here. I sent emails, I knocked on doors, I warned them. But the HOA called it beautification. Karen, my neighbor, laughed in my face. Then one morning after a storm, she skidded through the mud and crashed her SUV into my front porch. And that was just the beginning. I used to think my cul-de-sac was the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened. Tucked in a sleepy corner of the suburbs, our little street, Cypress Glen Lane, was a picture of ordinary peace, neatly trimmed lawns, aging maples lining the sidewalks, and neighbors who waved but didn't pry. It was the kind of neighborhood you move into when you're ready to slow down. For me, it was perfect. After retiring from 21 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, I didn't want noise. I wanted stability. I wanted a home where my teenage daughter Mia could finish high school without the chaos that had marked the earlier parts of her childhood. Her mother, my ex-wife, had remarried and moved across the country. I got full custody, and Cypress Glen Lane seemed like the right kind of boring for both of us. The Homeowners Association, Maple Grove Estates, HOA, wasn't exactly friendly, but they kept the hedges cut and the street lamps working. I paid my dues, followed the rules, and stayed out of their business. That's how it was supposed to work. Until one morning I noticed orange cones and construction tape strung up across the entrance to the Greenbelt Trail behind the retention wall. That was the first sign something was changing. At first, it looked like minor drainage work. Then came the surveyors, then the trucks. Big rumbling flatbeds that arrived at 6:45 in the morning and didn't leave until after dark. The HOA newsletter mentioned a soil redistribution project to improve stormwater management. I didn't think much of it at the time. Just another one of those HOA things. Unnecessary, expensive, and probably mismanaged, but I didn't have the energy to care. That changed the day I saw the first mud truck. It was massive, an open-bed dump truck filled to the brim with wet red clay. No cover, no tarp. Just mounds of slick, saturated earth stacked 5 feet above the truck walls, leaving a trail of sludge down the road as it exited the Greenbelt Trail and turned onto our street. At first, I thought it was a one-time mistake. But then came another. And another. By the end of that week, 5 to 7 trucks were coming in and out of our neighborhood every single day, each one leaving behind more of the red clay streaks of it across driveways, onto storm drains, splashing onto curbs. I watched a 6-year-old trip and fall face first into a puddle of it at the corner near the school bus stop. I had mud on my tires and my gutters and the cracks of my front steps. So I did what any reasonable homeowner would do. I wrote to the HOA. Dear Maple Grove Estates, HOA, I began. Please note that the ongoing construction activity has introduced a number of safety hazards and cleanliness issues to our street. The uncovered trucks are leaving significant debris behind, and this could easily result in slips damage to vehicles or worse. I signed it with my name and lot number. Polite, direct, respectful. They didn't respond. A few days later, I received an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a violation notice not for the mud, but for improper signage. Apparently, the small, slow, children at play sign I had staked in my front yard was out of compliance. It had been there for 2 years without issue. That's when I realized something was off. Around this time, I noticed Karen. Karen lived across the street and 2 doors down. Tall, thin, and loud in a way that made you flinch even from inside your house. She had been on the HOA board 2 years prior, but stepped down due to family obligations, though no one really knew what that meant. What we did know was that she still saw herself as the unofficial queen of Cypress Glen Lane, and she didn't like people rocking the boat. I was watering my front hedges one afternoon when she strutted over in wedge sandals and a blood-red blouse, sunglasses perched halfway down her nose. "You really gonna whine about a little mud?" she asked, not even bothering to say hello. I blinked at her, caught off guard. "It's not just mud. It's a public safety issue." She scoffed. "The board knows what they're doing. The mud is temporary." Why don't you focus on trimming that overgrown bush by your mailbox? Or is that not a priority for you? Then she turned on her heel and marched away like she'd won something. That was my first real warning. I wasn't just dealing with mud. I was dealing with people who had power and didn't like being challenged. Over the next week, the situation worsened. The trucks kept coming. The rain returned, and the mud multiplied. By now, tire tracks were caked into the road surface, and the drains had clogged with clay, causing water to pool. Delivery drivers began skipping the street altogether. One neighbor slipped stepping out of his car and twisted his ankle. A young couple's dog came back from a walk with mud so thick in its fur they had to shave parts of it off. The HOA sent out a cheerful update via email. Thank you for your patience during our beautification process. The results will be worth the temporary inconvenience. Temporary inconvenience. I was spending hours each day hosing mud off my porch and sweeping my driveway. Mia nearly missed her school bus because the driver couldn't pull over safely. And I wasn't alone, others started to whisper complaints too, though not everyone dared say them aloud. I began documenting everything: dates, truck license plates, photos of the spills, video of the trucks rumbling past clay sliding off the back like melting ice cream. I bought a dash cam and angled it toward the street. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it yet, but something in me had shifted. I'd been quiet for too long, and the storm hadn't even arrived yet. The first real spill happened on a Thursday morning. It had rained the night before, just a light drizzle, nothing out of the ordinary. But by 7:15 a.m., one of the largest mud trucks came barreling down Cypress Glen Lane, like it was late to a demolition derby. I was standing in my kitchen pouring coffee when I heard it, the groan of tires slipping, the metallic squeal of brakes, and then a wet guttural splatter, like a bucket of paint hitting concrete. I stepped out onto the front porch, coffee still steaming in my hand. There it was. A mountain of wet red clay, easily the size of a dining room table, dumped right in the center of the street. The back gate of the truck had apparently jostled loose, and the entire load had spilled out as the driver made a sharp right turn at the end of the Greenbelt construction zone. Clay oozed across the road, blocking the flow of water to the storm drains and pushing into the gutter in front of the Jacobsons' house. The truck kept going. No one got out. No cones, no flags, no cleanup. Just a roaring engine fading into the distance. I grabbed my phone and started recording. By 7:40, the school bus for the elementary kids came crawling up the road and stopped short. The driver rolled down her window and stared at the mess. Kids huddled near the back, wide-eyed. One brave mom waded through the mud barefoot to retrieve her son, looking like she'd stepped into a swamp. By 8:00, I'd filed my first complaint with the city's code enforcement department. By 9:00, I'd emailed the HOA again with photos, time-stamped video, and a plea for immediate cleanup. At 2:17 p.m., I received a reply. It was one sentence. The board is aware of the ongoing project and all operations are within compliance. No name, no phone number, no apology. That night, I walked across the street to see how bad it had gotten. The clay had hardened in spots and turned parts of the street into a jagged, uneven mess. One neighbor had tried using a snow shovel to scrape it up. Another laid plywood down just to get his car into the garage. Karen stood on her driveway with her arms crossed, watching me. "I hope you're not planning another one of your little crusades," she called out. "These trucks are here to help." Help with what I asked, wiping sweat from my brow. "They're turning the road into a hazard zone." She laughed. "You know what I think? I think some people just don't like change. Maybe you should have bought a cabin in the woods if you wanted to live in silence." I turned away before I said something I'd regret. But the next morning, I found a new violation taped to my door. This time, it was about excessive use of outdoor lighting. Apparently, the motion-activated floodlight I'd installed above my garage, specifically to deter nighttime truck traffic, was too bright for community standards. Never mind the fact that 3 other homes had the exact same fixture. It was targeted, obvious, and petty. So I documented that too. Every spill, every violation, every complaint ignored. I bought a binder, printed everything, and began building a case. My military training had taught me a few things about protocol, process, and paper trails. This wasn't a war zone, but I knew the value of details when fighting a system. By the 3rd week, the mud wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a serious threat. A contractor working on Mrs. Beckman's roof slipped on the clay at the edge of her driveway and dislocated his shoulder. The HOA shrugged it off. A new family that had just moved in from out of state emailed the board asking for a temporary waiver on their dues until cleanup happened. They got a final notice of delinquency instead. And the worst part, the mud was spreading. Stormwater carried it farther each day, pushing debris into storm drains, backing up gutters. One neighbor told me their backyard started flooding every time it rained. Another found clay seeping into his garage. It was like the street itself was slowly drowning in red sludge, and no one in power cared. I decided to escalate. I called the city's Department of Public Works and asked to speak to someone about hazardous materials on residential roads. I was transferred twice, then finally connected to a man named Dennis Lattimore. He was calm, curious, and after I sent him a few photos and video clips, he went very quiet. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said. "That doesn't look like a permitted load. And if those trucks aren't covered, they're in violation of municipal hauling codes." "Can the city do something?" I asked. "I can send someone out for a site inspection," he replied. "But if the HOA's project is on private land, our reach might be limited." That was when the paranoia started creeping in. Karen began parking her car partially in front of my driveway, just enough to make pulling out uncomfortable. I noticed HOA board member Ken Masters parked near my house twice in one day, sitting in his SUV with the engine running and a phone in his hand. Then I caught someone taking pictures of my property, an older woman I didn't recognize, standing near the sidewalk, snapping photos of my garage, then disappearing before I could ask why. I told myself I was imagining it, until I received another letter. This time, it wasn't a violation. It was a cease and desist, drafted by a law firm representing Maple Grove Estates HOA. It accused me of interfering with contracted operations, defaming board members, and creating a hostile environment. They gave me 7 days to remove my social media posts, cease recording HOA activity, and refrain from contact with any contractors working on behalf of the HOA. That was the moment it clicked. They weren't just sloppy. They were hiding something, and I had hit a nerve. They wanted me scared. They wanted me quiet. Instead, they were about to see just how loud I could get. The morning after I got the cease and desist letter, I found Karen standing at the edge of my property line, arms folded, phone in hand, a smug little smile stretching across her lips like she already knew something I didn't. "You've stirred up quite the drama, haven't you?" she said, not even bothering to hide the glee in her voice. "HOA's not too happy with you. But hey, you got their attention." I stared at her for a moment, jaw tight. "You mean the part where they threatened me for documenting illegal spills on public roads?" She stepped closer, phone still recording. "You keep using that word illegal like you're some kind of lawyer. Newsflash, you're not. These trucks are part of a sanctioned project. You're just bitter because someone finally decided to improve the neighborhood. Is that what you call this?" I gestured toward the sludge trailing along the curb, brownish red lines hardening into cement under the morning sun. "People can't even walk their dogs without slipping. Kids are dodging mudslides just to catch the school bus. And someone's going to get seriously hurt." Karen scoffed and rolled her eyes. "You're blowing this way out of proportion. A little mud never killed anyone." Her tone turned sharper, crueler. "You're just looking for something to control because your life is falling apart. Everyone knows it. Your wife left you. Your kid barely talks to anyone. And now you've made this your crusade because you don't have anything else going on." The words hit harder than I expected. Not because she was right, but because she had clearly been digging. There's a kind of cruelty that only comes from people who feel protected, insulated. The kind that weaponizes your past in hopes of shaming you into silence. I said nothing. I didn't need to. I turned and walked back up my driveway and closed the door behind me. But my hands were shaking. Not with fear, with resolve. That afternoon, Mia came home from school, dropped her bag in the hallway, and asked Dad, "Why did Karen tell Jenna that we're suing the HOA?" I looked up from my laptop, my heart sinking. "Wait," she said, "what?" "She told Jenna's mom that you're taking the HOA to court and that we're going to bankrupt the neighborhood. Now some of the kids think I'm the reason we're not getting a new playground." I stood up, jaw tight. "That's not true. I haven't filed anything. Not yet." Mia nodded, but I could see the tension behind her eyes. The way her shoulders hunched forward just a little. The way she avoided eye contact. She'd already been through enough transitions, new school, new house, new life. Now she had to deal with social fallout over something she had nothing to do with. I walked over and knelt in front of her. "Listen," I said, voice soft. "You didn't do anything wrong. This isn't about you. It's about doing the right thing. And sometimes when you do that, people try to make it harder for you. But I promise you I'm not backing down. Not when people like Karen think they can bully us. She didn't say anything, but she hugged me, tightly, the way she used to when she was little. That night, the mud trucks returned. 3 of them. One at 7:12 p.m., 2 more at 8:03. I caught all of them on video as they rolled past my house with uncovered loads, tires flinging chunks of clay into the street with each rotation. By then, I had built a small network, 3 other neighbors who were just as fed up as I was. Tom, the retired postal worker, Mina, a pediatric nurse, and Anthony, a former paralegal who had been living in the neighborhood for 15 years. We started exchanging emails, comparing photos, logging times, truck numbers, routes. And what we saw was damning. The trucks weren't using the designated construction route outlined in the HOA's own newsletter. They were cutting across residential roads to save time. The loads weren't covered. Some of the drivers didn't even wear proper safety gear. And worst of all, we caught one truck dumping material near a public drain, a clear violation of county environmental codes. But every time we raised the issue, we were met with silence or worse, retaliation. Karen posted in the neighborhood Facebook group that certain individuals were harassing workers and putting personal vendettas above community improvement. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. Her friends started chiming in, painting me as the problem, angry, unstable, toxic. One comment even read, "He's probably one of those sovereign citizen types. Just mad no one listens to him anymore." That was when I realized they weren't just protecting the trucks, they were protecting the entire illusion. The HOA had sold this project as a community enhancement, a necessary upgrade to prevent future flooding and soil erosion. To admit it was being mismanaged, or worse, illegally operated, would expose them to liability, to scrutiny, to lawsuits. And people like Karen had built their entire sense of purpose on being gatekeepers of the community's image. To them, I wasn't a neighbor, I was a threat. But they underestimated how much I had left to lose. Late one night, after everyone had gone to bed, I opened a private browser tab and started digging into public records. I found the city's permitting database. I found Maple Grove Estates HOA's original charter. I found the name of the company operating the trucks, Hess Earthworks and Grading, and cross-referenced them with recent code violations. Turns out Hess Earthworks and Grading had been cited twice in the past 2 years for improper soil storage and unauthorized dumping. I also found a contract summary submitted to the HOA by the company, which included a load schedule that didn't match the actual truck activity we'd recorded. According to the documents, there should have only been 3 trips per week. We had logged nearly 3 dozen in 10 days. The pieces were coming together. I didn't need to fight Karen directly. I needed to expose the lie she was clinging to. I filed a formal complaint with the county's Environmental Enforcement Division. I attached photos, videos, and a statement describing the mud spills, the safety hazards, the violations, and the retaliation I'd faced. I sent a copy to my neighbors, to the HOA board, and strategically to the local news tip line for Channel 5. And I ended the email with one sentence: "If someone gets hurt on this road, the blood is on your hands." Less than 24 hours later, Karen showed up at my door. This time she wasn't smug, she was fuming. "You want to start a war," she hissed, stepping closer than she ever had before. "Be careful. You're not as untouchable as you think." I didn't blink, and I didn't step back. "I'm not starting a war," I said. "I'm ending one." She stormed off her heels, clicking like gunshots against the muddy pavement. It rained hard the night before it all fell apart. Not a hurricane, not a freak weather event, just an honest, steady downpour that soaked the earth for 6 hours straight. The kind of rain you'd sleep through if the world outside wasn't made of clay and poor decisions. But I was up most of the night, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and my laptop, going over everything I had sent to the county. Mia had gone to bed early. She was exhausted. The tension in the house was something even she and her teenage detachment couldn't ignore. It was in the air, thick as the humidity rising off our muddy street. I hadn't told her how many trucks I'd counted that week, 18. All uncovered, all leaving ribbons of red clay behind them like breadcrumbs leading to a crime scene. By morning, the street didn't look like a street anymore. It looked like a trench line from a war zone. The clay had mixed with rainwater overnight and turned into a thick, pulpy slush. It blanketed the entire road from curb to curb, several inches deep in places. It was no longer streaks or splatter, it was a full-on mud flow, creeping into driveways, pooling against foundations. The mailboxes looked like sinking tombstones. Lawn decorations were half submerged. My neighbor's trash bins had slid halfway down the block. I opened the door at 6:40 a.m., coffee untouched in my hand, and I stood there in disbelief. Then I heard it. A car engine revving, tires spinning, a metallic clunk, then a sharp screech, and finally a thud. Karen. Her white SUV, a late model Lexus, the kind she always bragged about leasing at a professional discount, was halfway off the road and wedged into a thick pile of mud right at the end of her driveway. One rear wheel was completely buried. The other spun in place like a drill spitting red sludge in all directions. She was standing outside, phone in one hand, screaming at no one in particular. "This is ridiculous. I have a meeting in 30 minutes, she yelled. "This is a hazard. This is unsafe." I stayed silent, watching from my porch, biting back the bitter irony. For weeks she had defended the trucks, laughed off the mud, mocked my complaints, and now she was ankle-deep in the very thing she swore was just a little dirt. She saw me watching and shouted, "Are you happy now? This is your fault. You stirred everyone up. You slowed the project down." Before I could answer, her front tire found a patch of clay and slipped fast. The SUV lurched forward, careening off the shallow embankment of her lawn and into the street, sliding like a sled. She screamed, clutching the door handle, running beside the vehicle in a panic. I sprinted. The car wasn't stopping. It spun once, fishtailed, then barreled straight across the slick road, headed directly for my yard. There was no time to think, no time to shout. I just watched helpless as her SUV jumped the curb, tore through my front hedges, smashed into my porch steps, and finally came to rest with a crunch of plastic and splintering wood. Silence. Even the rain seemed to pause. Karen stood there, drenched, shaking, lips parted in shock. Her SUV sat partially inside my front lawn, half embedded in the porch frame, one headlight dangling by its wiring. The mud trail behind it looked like a wound sliced across the neighborhood. Mia opened the front door just as I turned around. "Dad." I raised a hand, shielding her. "Go back inside." Within minutes, neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the crash, the yelling, the sight of Karen covered in clay and trembling like a soaked cat. Some tried to help her. Others stood frozen. A few pulled out their phones. "Somebody call 911, she shrieked. For what? Someone muttered. "You're the one who crashed." Karen turned, eyes wild, and pointed at me. He created this mess. He's been harassing the HOA, delaying the work. If the road had been cleaned properly..." I cut her off, calmly, coldly. "No. If the HOA hadn't dumped 15 tons of untreated clay across a residential street without permits or proper containment, none of this would have happened. And you defended them." Repeatedly. She lunged toward me, slipping in the mud and landing hard on her knees. Someone gasped. That's when the police arrived. 2 officers responding to a report of a vehicular accident on private property. They saw the SUV lodged against my porch, saw Karen shouting incoherently, covered in mud, and took one look at me, standing still, arms down, silent, and asked me what happened. I showed them the footage from my front camera. They nodded, took statements, measured tire marks, asked if I wanted to press charges. I said no. Let the footage do the talking. Let the scene speak for itself. But deep down, something in me cracked open. Not anger, not vengeance. Clarity. This wasn't just about mud anymore. It was about what happens when people in power believe they're untouchable. When they build a wall of rules to protect themselves, then break those rules with impunity. When they deflect blame onto the ones sounding the alarm. That night, after Karen's SUV was towed away and the porch taped off with caution ribbon, I sat with Mia at the kitchen table. We ate sandwiches in silence, both exhausted. She looked up at me mid-bite. "I don't think she's going to come back from that." I nodded slowly. Neither will the HOA. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line that evening, word had already spread across the entire neighborhood. It was like wildfire. Karen, the self-proclaimed mouthpiece of the HOA, had driven her luxury SUV straight through my hedges and into my front porch. No one used her name in the group chat. No one had to. There were only pictures now. Photos from 4 angles. Karen's Lexus, nose deep in red sludge, one wheel up on the crumbled edge of my porch, a sagging gutter crushed beneath the front fender. A shattered garden lantern buried beneath tire tread. Someone had even taken a wide shot from the cul-de-sac, showing the SUV like a trophy in the battlefield of HOA arrogance. But what really struck people was the caption someone added beneath it. She said it was just a little mud. I didn't post it. I didn't need to. The truth had taken on a life of its own. Still, I spent that night outside with a headlamp measuring damage. The porch frame was split in 2 places. One of the support beams had cracked at the base, meaning I'd need to bring in a contractor. I found pieces of Karen's front grille wedged into the soil next to Mia's ceramic wind chime shattered beyond repair. It was a gift from her mother years ago, one of the few things that had survived our cross-country move. I held the fragments in my palm and let the weight settle. This wasn't just property damage, this was personal. And yet, when the HOA finally responded the next morning, it wasn't with concern, it was with condemnation. A letter printed on official Maple Grove Estates HOA stationery was folded into an envelope and dropped into my mailbox. I recognized the sharp, slanted handwriting on the front Ken Masters board president. Inside 3 lines. We regret the unfortunate incident involving one of our community members. However, your failure to maintain an adequate setback from the street contributed to the incident. Any repairs required are solely your responsibility under Section 4.9 of the Community Code. That was it. No apology, no offer of help, no mention of the weeks of documented mud, the trucks, the complaints. Just another threat, buried in faux legalese. Mia read it over my shoulder and said quietly, "They're blaming you." I nodded. Of course they are. That's what people like this do, they rewrite the story. But there's footage, proof. There always is, I said. But proof doesn't mean anything to people who think they're the ones writing the rules. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to pull the whole thing into daylight. I started with the city inspector Dennis Lattimore, the one who'd responded to my emails weeks earlier. I sent him the footage of the crash, the letter from the HOA, and a full spreadsheet of truck activity dates, times license plate numbers, notes on the condition of the road each day. Then I called my homeowner's insurance rep and walked them through the accident. He was silent for most of the conversation, until I said the magic phrase, documented negligence by a third-party contractor hired by a governing body. From there, the floodgates opened. Within 48 hours, my insurance company had issued a formal notice of subrogation. They intended to pursue the HOA and its contractor for damages. That letter alone was enough to force the board's hand. They scheduled an emergency meeting, but they didn't invite me. They invited Karen. I know this because one of the board members, Melissa, who had always seemed uncomfortable during past HOA events, forwarded me the agenda. Discussion item 3, incident on lot 42, liability, insurance, and member statement, KR. Karen was being given a platform to shift the narrative, to reframe the crash as a freak accident caused by slippery roads and improper landscaping. They were going to build a wall of words around her and hope it held. But what they didn't know was that I had already filed a public records request with the city, and what I got in return was pure gold. Turns out the HOA had submitted no formal permit applications for soil redistribution. In fact, the Greenbelt project wasn't a sanctioned infrastructure improvement at all, it was a private landscaping deal. The board had made with Hess Earthworks and grading under the guise of erosion control. Their own minutes showed a vote conducted via email and a legal action under city ordinance for open meeting compliance. Not only were they spilling mud across public roads, they were doing it without a single line of legal authority. I waited. I let the emergency meeting take place. Then I posted everything publicly. Video of the trucks, the crash, the footage from my porch camera, the cease and desist letter, the agenda from the board meeting, the contract between the HOA and Hess Earthworks and grading, the city documents confirming no permit had been filed, and one final post, a close-up photo of Karen's SUV lodged into my porch beam, overlaid with a quote from the HOA letter, blaming me. Your failure to maintain an adequate setback. Within 12 hours, the post had over 300 comments. Neighbors I hadn't heard from in years started emailing. Parents at Mia's school stopped me in the parking lot. Even the mail carrier told me he saw the photos on a local news blog. And then came the knock on the door. Karen, no longer wearing her signature red blouse. No makeup. Hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. Her voice was shaking. "I need you to take it all down," she said. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Why?" "They're threatening to remove me from the board. My lawyer says you're damaging my reputation." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the reputation you built by mocking my complaints, by defending unsafe practices that put the entire street at risk, by crashing into my house, and then blaming me for it?" She went quiet. "They're going to make me the scapegoat," she whispered. "They've already drafted a motion." For the first time, I saw something in her face I hadn't expected. Not arrogance, not rage. Fear. I didn't say yes, I didn't say no. I just said, "Maybe you should have thought of that," before calling it just a little mud. And I closed the door. It didn't take long for the board to go into full damage control. Within 2 days of my public post going viral in our community forums, the HOA scrubbed their website of all project references. The term Soil Redistribution Initiative disappeared. The original newsletter announcing the Greenbelt improvements was replaced with a vague placeholder titled Ongoing Grounds, Maintenance, Weather Delays Possible. Gone was the language about enhanced drainage and erosion resilience. It was as if the project had never existed at all. But people had screenshots now. Receipts. Their attempt to rewrite history only fueled the fire. Still, they tried. They always do. I received a certified letter on a Thursday morning delivered by a man in a golf cart, no less. Inside a formal notice of community code violations for the following infractions: unauthorized modifications to porch structure, damage to HOA common landscaping, and public dissemination of board communications without consent, use of surveillance devices aimed at public property. Each violation was paired with an outrageous fine. $250 for the porch lighting I had installed 6 months earlier, $400 for the unauthorized camera pointed at the street, $300 for defamatory communication against a board member. It was absurd, brazen. They were trying to bankrupt me into silence. I stood there on my porch clutching the letter, the dent in my steps still visible, where Karen's SUV had left a jagged scar. The sheer gall of it nearly knocked the wind out of me. They had failed to manage a construction site, polluted our road, nearly injured half the block, and now they were coming after me because I dared to speak. I laughed. It was bitter, but real. Mia poked her head out the door. "What is it this time?" "Just the HOA trying to fine us for getting hit by a car," I said, waving the letter. She blinked. "That's not a thing, right?" "Not legally, but they're banking on us not fighting back." I looked down at the paperwork again, then back toward the end of the street where the trucks used to idle, where the mud still crusted the gutters like dried blood. "Time to escalate," I muttered. The next day, I met with Dennis Lattimore from the city's Environmental Enforcement Division. He brought a clipboard, a folder of printed photos I'd emailed, and a thin smile that didn't quite hide how angry he was. "Let me show you something," he said, kneeling beside one of the storm drains near my mailbox. He slid off the metal grate, then pointed a flashlight inside. The interior was half-choked with sediment clay deposits so thick they'd hardened like concrete. Water trickled through at a slow, awkward angle, barely moving. Dennis shook his head. 30% blockage, he said, possibly more down the line. Because of the trucks, no question. And based on runoff flow, this entire system was likely compromised by uncontained materials. He stood up and pulled out a form from his folder. "This is a formal citation against Hess Earthworks and Grading. It opens a violation investigation that could lead to both fines and cleanup orders. I'll also be forwarding this to the city attorney and the stormwater compliance team." I exhaled. It was the first time I'd felt a tangible consequence for their actions. "Is there anything I can do to help move it forward?" Dennis looked at me for a long moment. "Actually, yes. If you're willing to give a statement under oath, we can initiate a public hearing process. That brings the HOA into it because they contracted the work." "Let's do it," I said. The hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later. Word got out fast, first through whispers, then through direct messages, then in the most HOA of all ways, a passive-aggressive flyer left in every mailbox. Notice of city action neighborhood support needed for continued improvements. It was laughable. The HOA was asking for residents to show up and defend the project, claiming the city was threatening vital upgrades to community infrastructure. They framed the hearing as an attack on progress, on beautification, on property values. But when the day arrived, the seats told a different story. Of the 27 people who attended, 20 were there to speak against the HOA. One by one, they stepped up to the mic. Tom brought photos of the time his car skidded into his own fence due to mud. Mina described how her toddler slipped and bruised his chin during a walk. Anthony presented printouts of the HOA's own newsletters compared against permit records from the city, proof that the project had never been properly authorized. And then it was my turn. I stood at the front of the municipal hearing room, camera lights in the corners, bored clerks at their desks. And I told the story. From the first mud trail to the retaliation letters, from the crash to the cover-up. I spoke for 12 uninterrupted minutes, not as an engineer or a retired soldier or a man fighting a fine, but as a father trying to protect his home from people who thought they were above consequence. Karen didn't attend. Neither did Ken Masters. Only one board member showed up, Melissa, and she said nothing. When the hearing ended, Dennis thanked me quietly. "You did more than most ever would," he said. 3 days later, I received a copy of the findings. The city issued a $25,000 fine to Hess Earthworks and Grading for improper disposal and transport violations. The HOA was ordered to cover all cleanup costs associated with the Greenbelt project. And perhaps most satisfying, a formal citation was issued against Maple Grove Estates HOA for misrepresentation of scope, failure to file permits, and retaliatory enforcement actions against a resident. They had to rescind all fines levied against me. My porch repairs were reimbursed through their own insurance policy. But more than that, they were exposed. That's when I made a decision. I wasn't just going to fight their actions. I was going to expose their infrastructure. From the inside out. It started with a simple records request. In our state, most HOA charters amendments and structural plans have to be filed with the county registrar's office. So I logged onto the portal and began searching. What I found was a tangle of contradictory filings, outdated plans and amendments, with no formal votes recorded. There were at least 3 separate documents referencing the greenbelt behind my house, each with a slightly different land use description. One called it Common Area D Nature Preserve. Another called it Drainage Buffer. A third called it Community Improvement Zone. That alone was a red flag. You don't change land designations like that unless you're hiding something. So I dug deeper. I pulled parcel maps and overlaid zoning codes. I found that the section of land the trucks had accessed was all technically non-developable under city stormwater ordinances. Due to its slope and proximity to a protected runoff corridor, that meant any project involving soil movement, grading, or vehicle traffic on that land required a Class B environmental work permit. There was no such permit on record. No application, no variance, nothing. I called the city again this time, not environmental enforcement, but planning and zoning. A woman named Elise picked up. Her tone was skeptical at first, just another homeowner complaining about their HOA. But when I mentioned the parcel ID and lack of permit, her voice shifted. "Wait," she said. "That's a restricted drainage parcel. Any disturbance within 50 feet of the runoff channel is supposed to trigger an automatic review." I could almost hear her scrolling through records. "There's no review request here, and no permit issued within the last 18 months. What happens if work was done without it?" I asked. She paused. "That's a violation. A serious one. You said heavy trucks were used." "Uncovered mud trucks," I said, "daily for nearly 6 weeks. Another pause. "I need to escalate this." The next step was to identify the contract behind the trucks. I'd already found references in internal HOA emails and the flyer from their spring newsletter. But the contract itself, the binding agreement between the HOA and the company, was what I needed. And that's where my Army background came in handy. During my last few years in the Corps of Engineers, I worked with civil procurement teams, learning how to read bids, analyze invoices, flag inconsistencies. I knew the red flags, vague scope language, flat rate contracts, absent performance clauses, so I filed a formal request with the HOA under our state's Homeowners Transparency Act, a rarely used statute that required board disclosure of vendor contracts if a homeowner suspected misuse of funds or procedural violation. They had 7 days to respond. On day 5, I received a flash drive in the mail. No note, no signature, just a plain envelope with a return address from the HOA's legal firm. Inside were PDFs, hundreds of pages. and the original project scope, and bid requests from Hess, Earthworks, and Grading, and 2 smaller companies, and meeting notes from a closed session where the board voted on the contract. And finally, the service agreement itself. I stayed up all night reading. What I found was jaw-dropping. The contract had been backdated by 2 weeks, signed the day after the trucks started rolling in, but marked as if it were signed beforehand. The scope of work was blanket worded, with no specific limits on soil volume, number of truck trips, or oversight requirements. Worse, the document included an indemnity clause that waived all liability for Hess, Earthworks, and Grading in the event of damage to adjacent private property, a clause that no responsible HOA would sign unless they had something to hide. In short, the board had signed away accountability before the project even began. I printed everything. 3 copies, 1 for my records, 1 for Elise at Planning and Zoning, and 1 for the city attorney who had attended the earlier hearing. When I dropped the documents off, Elise flipped through the pages with an expression somewhere between disbelief and disgust. "This is bad," she said. "This kind of clause is illegal under the new ordinance code. HOA boards can't shield contractors from residential liability like this anymore, not after the Stonebridge case." "So what happens now?" I asked. She looked up. "If we confirm the land was disturbed illegally, the HOA could be forced to restore it fully, grading, landscaping, sediment removal. And if public safety was compromised, fines, possibly board sanctions." And that's when she leaned in. "You might want to consider filing a civil suit." I blinked. "Against the HOA. Against the HOA and the board members personally. If they knowingly approved an illegal contract and used intimidation to silence opposition, they may have breached fiduciary duty." I didn't say anything right away, but inside something shifted again. This wasn't just about mud trucks or property damage. It was about abuse of power. About people who treated a neighborhood like a kingdom and themselves like monarchs. About a system that only worked if everyone else stayed quiet, compliant, afraid. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. So I called my insurance company, asked for their legal counsel, and scheduled a meeting. It was time to bring everything forward. And this time, I wasn't going to stop at getting reimbursed. I was going to get the truth on public record, and I was going to make sure that no other homeowner in this neighborhood would ever have to go through this again. 2 days after dropping off the contract documents, I got a call from Elise. Her voice was tight serious. "You might want to sit down for this," she said. I was already standing in the driveway, adjusting a new temporary support beam under my damaged porch. I'd spent the morning on the phone with a contractor and Mia's school counselor trying to juggle repairs, legal calls, and the aftershocks of the now infamous Karen crash. "What's going on?" I asked, wiping sweat from my brow. "We completed our audit of the HOA filings. The greenbelt work they claimed was approved via board vote." She paused. "It was never actually recorded in the meeting minutes submitted to the county, which means they're in violation of the Open HOA Governance Act." That hit me like a hammer. "So all of this, the contract, the trucks, the mud spill, none of it was legally authorized," she finished. I leaned against the porch railing and let out a long breath. Elise went on. "The Planning Office and Environmental Compliance Division are jointly submitting a formal citation. But that's not the big one." I straightened up. City Legal's opening an investigation into HOA misconduct, and they're naming individual board members. That was the moment I knew. They were no longer shielded by the group. The wall they'd been hiding behind paperwork, bylaws, silence was crumbling. Now they would face the fallout as individuals. But I wasn't finished. I still had one more piece to play. One I had been holding in my back pocket, waiting for the moment they tried to rewrite the past. And that moment came swiftly. On the neighborhood's internal HOA portal, a new official statement appeared under the heading, "Clarification regarding recent construction concerns." It was the most sanitized, deflective nonsense I'd ever read. The post claimed one of the mud trucks had only been used during designated hours, and all necessary permits were secured in coordination with city staff. And the Karen crash was due to inclement weather and unusual road conditions, not any wrongdoing. Best of all, that my unauthorized surveillance contributed to neighborhood discomfort and harassment. They were trying to make me the villain. So I logged into my private archive, opened the folder I had labeled Cam Logs, and pulled out the file titled 12 Cam Side Yard Movie. It was a video from 3 weeks ago, just after sunset. grainy but clear enough. The footage showed a man, Ken Masters, the HOA president, walking along the side of my property at dusk with a flashlight and a camera. He wasn't wearing an HOA badge. He wasn't leaving a notice. He was skulking, peering through the gaps in my side gate, snapping pictures of my backyard. I never confronted him. I wanted to, but I didn't need a confrontation. I needed proof. Now I had it. I clipped the footage, added the date and timestamp overlay, and uploaded it alongside the HOA's public statement in the neighborhood Facebook group. My caption: "If they're comfortable lying in writing, imagine what they do in the dark." It exploded. Dozens of comments poured in within minutes. Wait, that's Ken. Are we just going to ignore the fact he was trespassing? Oh, they said they were being harassed. What is this then? Time to vote every single one of them out. But the real turning point came when Melissa, the soft-spoken board member who had mostly remained silent, posted a comment of her own. "I didn't vote for this contract. I wasn't told about the backdated agreement. I've been pressured for months not to speak. I'm sorry I stayed silent for so long." That broke the floodgates. 3 other former board members, too, who had resigned over the past year, reached out to me privately. One, a woman named Brenda, met me for coffee and handed me an email chain between Ken and Hess Earthworks and Grading, where Ken openly admitted that if the trucks only ran during peak hours, the neighbors wouldn't notice the runoff. He knew. He knew what the mud would do. He knew the road couldn't handle it. He gambled with the safety of dozens of families, and then when caught, doubled down on blame. So I brought it all together. The footage, the emails, the permit violations, the board's public lies, and I compiled them into a formal complaint with the State HOA Oversight Commission, the highest level of regulatory scrutiny in our state. It wasn't easy. It took 11 attachments, 5 notarized statements, and 3 phone interviews. But by the end of the week, I received confirmation that the commission had opened a full investigation into Maple Grove Estates HOA, its board, and all affiliated contractors. The final piece of the puzzle came ironically from one of the HOA's own hired security officers. He reached out anonymously, told me his company had been pressured to report on hostile residents. Specifically me and Tom, the retired postal worker. He said they were asked to monitor our movements, document when we left our homes, and provide photos of gatherings or meetings that could be construed as anti-HOA organizing. He had quit the job out of disgust, but not before saving a few choice photos and some audio clips of board members discussing getting dirt on me to undermine my insurance claim. Surveillance, intimidation, retaliation, all of it documented. I packaged everything and sent it to my attorney. That night, I stood in my driveway and looked up at the night sky, clouds, thinning stars peeking through. Mia walked out beside me. "Is it over?" she asked. "Not yet," I said, "but we're winning." Because it wasn't just about restoring a porch, or getting back at Karen, or making a board pay for a muddy mistake. It was about taking back something far more important: the right to stand your ground when everyone else tells you to sit down. Within 2 weeks of the state investigation being announced, a local news outlet picked up the story. It started with a headline that felt almost surreal to read, considering how it all began. Suburban HOA under investigation for illegal dumping, retaliation, and surveillance tactics. They had used a photo of my porch from the day of the crash, Karen's SUV still embedded in the corner, with caution tape blowing gently in the wind, like it was trying to warn the whole world about what happens when authority forgets accountability. From there, the story gained traction. Larger news outlets began requesting interviews. A city council member issued a public statement calling for a complete overhaul of how HOAs in our jurisdiction are allowed to operate. Even the mayor's office weighed in, announcing the formation of a neighborhood oversight task force, and a term I never thought I'd hear used in the same breath as Maple Grove Estates. But what hit hardest was what happened inside our own community. Because the silence broke. Neighbors who had stayed quiet out of fear, some for months, some for years, started coming forward. Mr. and Mrs. Jacobson shared how they'd been fined for repainting their door the wrong shade of taupe, only to find out later that Karen had changed the palette, without notifying anyone. A woman named Sherry, who lived near the community tennis court, revealed that the HOA had threatened to revoke her gate access after she questioned the budget increase for landscaping. And Tom, the retired postal worker, admitted that 2 years ago, Ken had shown up uninvited on his porch at 10 p.m., clipboard in hand, warning him not to stir up resentment about the HOA's budget shortfall. These weren't isolated events. They were a pattern, a culture of intimidation wrapped in HOA letterhead and neighborhood buzzwords like compliance and standards and the good of the community. But now that veneer was cracking. Melissa, the only board member to show her face, at the city hearing formally resigned. Her letter cited a profound breach of ethical boundaries and stated that the board had become less a steward of community and more a shield for control. The very next day, Ken Masters received a formal notice from the State HOA Oversight Commission, informing him that he was being investigated for falsification of contract dates, use of HOA funds without member approval, retaliatory enforcement practices, invasion of privacy through unauthorized surveillance. He denied everything, of course, filed a statement calling it a coordinated smear campaign. But the damage was done. He tried to call an emergency HOA meeting to restore order. Only 6 people showed up, and 4 of them were there to serve him legal documents. Hess Earthworks and Grading the Contractor at the center of the mud spill quietly removed their signage from the Greenbelt entrance and scrubbed all references to the Maple Grove project from their website. A month later, the city levied a $40,000 fine against them for unpermitted soil dumping and environmental disruption of a protected runoff zone. But it was the residents themselves who delivered the final blow. We organized, not through HOA flyers or email blasts, but through whispered conversations, driveway chats, and a single Facebook post that read, "If you're tired of being bullied in your own neighborhood, come to the park this Saturday at 3 p.m. Let's talk about change." 52 people showed up, more than half the neighborhood. We stood in folding chairs and on picnic benches beneath the maple trees and discussed what came next. How we wanted our community to function. How power should be shared, not hoarded. How rules should exist to protect, not punish. I didn't lead the meeting. I didn't want to. But when someone asked who would be willing to run for the new board, assuming the state dissolved the current one, I raised my hand, and others followed. 3 weeks later, a letter from the State HOA Oversight Commission arrived in every mailbox on Cypress Glen Lane. Notice of board dissolution and mandated special election. The board was officially disbanded. The HOA's operations were placed under temporary state oversight, pending new elections. Ken Karen and 2 other members were barred from holding board positions for 5 years. They were also required to attend compliance and ethics training if they ever wanted to reapply. Karen didn't wait around to hear the rest. She listed her house the same week. The for sale sign went up on a Tuesday and was gone by Friday. I never saw her again. But her absence didn't erase the damage. I spent over $17,000 repairing the porch. Another $3,400 came out of pocket for the trenching and resurfacing of my front yard. Insurance helped eventually, but there were still emotional costs. Trust lost. Sleep disturbed. Mia's nervous glances out the window when she saw unfamiliar cars passing by. We paid the price. But we also made them pay. Not just in fines or resignations, but in exposure. In the one currency that power hoarders fear most, the truth that they'd lied, the truth that they'd retaliated, the truth that they'd tried to surveil a man who simply wanted his daughter to feel safe walking home from school. The new board was elected 2 months later. 5 members, 3 of them completely new to HOA leadership. No one had campaign signs. No one slung mud, metaphorical or otherwise. We held an open forum at the library. We listened. We drafted a new charter together, and I sat in the back row while others spoke, because I didn't want a spotlight. I just wanted a neighborhood that took care of its people, not one that punished them for asking questions. The first thing I rebuilt wasn't the porch. It was the garden. Small, stubborn, and personal, just like everything I'd fought to protect. A few native perennials in fresh soil. River stones I dug up myself from a nearby creek bed. I planted salvia because it blooms defiantly through heat and mud. I planted rosemary for resilience. And I left a little space open in the center, a soft patch of mulch where the old wind chime had once swayed. Mia helped me dig. She didn't talk much that first morning, just knelt beside me in the quiet, light dirt under her nails, earbuds. Half in head, bobbing slightly to music I couldn't hear. But when we stopped to drink water, she asked, "Do you think it'll ever feel normal again?" I looked at her, really looked, and realized she wasn't asking about the plants. I don't want it to be normal again, I said. I want it to be better. She nodded, and we kept digging. The porch was finished within 3 weeks. Stained cedar steps, reinforced beams, a new railing that I built with my own hands using leftover lumber from the contractor's crew. I could have let them do it, but I wanted to put something of myself back into the bones of the house. Something that couldn't be bought or bulldozed or intimidated into silence. Each screw I drove in was a kind of healing, each cut of wood a reclaiming. I hung a new wind chime above the entrance, handmade this time. Recycled copper pipes tuned low and warm. Mia said it didn't sound like the old one, and I told her that was the point. We weren't going back. We were going forward. A month later, I received a certified letter, only this time, it was good news. Settlement approved. The HOA's insurance had agreed to pay the full amount for property damage, including additional funds for distress and inconvenience. The contractor Hess, Earthworks and Grading had been blacklisted from bidding on city contracts for 2 years. And Ken Masters, former HOA president, was facing civil litigation from at least 2 other homeowners who had been wrongly fined during his tenure. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer next to my Army medals, not out of pride, but as proof that even a system stacked against you can be bent back toward justice if you're willing to stand long enough. Karen never came back. She didn't send an apology, not a text, not a note, just vanished. Her house sold to a quiet couple with 2 toddlers and a 3-legged dog named Murphy. They introduced themselves on their first day and brought muffins. The neighborhood began to change, not overnight, but slowly, like ice melting off a roof in spring. People smiled more. Front porches stayed lit longer in the evenings. Kids played in the street again. And once, just once, I saw a chalk drawing on the sidewalk in front of my house. And thanks for saving the neighborhood. No one signed it. They didn't have to. Mia and I spent that summer repainting the kitchen. Just the 2 of us. She picked a pale green that reminded her of the forest in Oregon we used to hike through when things were still new between us. We played music loud, danced like idiots on the drop cloths, and ate dinner on the floor every night until the cabinets dried. One evening, while taping the window frames, she asked me, "Do you regret it, getting into it with the HOA?" I paused, then said, "I regret letting it go on as long as I did, but standing up to them, no, never." She smiled. "You looked kind of scary during the meeting," she said, like powerful, but in a good way. That hit harder than I expected, because for a long time, I'd felt powerless, like life was something that kept happening to me. Retirement, divorce, moving states, trying to raise a daughter who had every reason to doubt me. But now I'd found something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Agency. Not just to fight back, but to lead, to protect, to rebuild. The garden bloomed late that year. The salvia grew tall, and unruly purple blossoms reaching toward the mailbox. The rosemary pushed wide against the path. And one morning, I found something nestled in the mulch where the wind chime used to be. A small stone hand-painted with the word, peace. I never found out who left it, but I didn't need to. It wasn't for me exactly. It was for what we had all fought for. A sense of shared safety. A reminder that justice doesn't always come in courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes it comes in the quiet spaces that follow. In the sound of a wind chime on a rebuilt porch. In the laughter of a daughter who no longer looks over her shoulder. In the silence of a street that once drowned in mud, now dry, clean, and whole again. I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who got tired of being pushed. But if there's one thing I learned from all this, it's that sometimes you have to let them crash into your home before people will finally see the mess they've made. And when they do, you make sure they never forget it.